Do you think this is going to be a new sea change in terms of pressure on the banks? And if so, which banks in particular?
I don't see it. No, I don't see a big sea change. There have been several sea changes, sort of tsunamis of sea changes, right? The Dodd-Frank law, the Volcker rule, really imposed strict new regulations on the banks, much needed regulation on the bank. Then President Trump comes in and begins to roll back a fair amount of that. But really for smaller banks, not the big Wall Street banks that we think of. They're still very heavily regulated, and I think fairly regulated. I don't think the change in the House leadership is really going to have a big effect on that, although Maxine Walters will hold hearings, and that'll probably result in...
So you just see it as annoying for them?
Yeah, well, I mean, not annoying, because you can't use that word per se. I mean, it's important. They have to be taken seriously. She's a very astute politician.
No, but I mean for the big banks that get called in for hearings and subpoenas and all of that.
Yeah, they're going to have to deal with that, and that is going to be part of their new reality, which they haven't had to deal with in the last 2 years.
Jimmy, how much power does the House Financial Services Committee actually have when it comes to regulating banks?
Listen, some very important legislation can begin there. Now, do I think that is a today issue? I think it's headline risk today, but real risk for the banks tomorrow. Listen, Ocasio-Cortez is very good at doing is putting issues into the Democratic agenda and raising their profile where they weren't big issues before, whether it's this Green New Deal idea or raising the top tax rate to 70%. She's someone who ran on a really progressive, populist, egalitarian agenda, break up the big banks, bring in Glass-Steagall, allow people to open up bank accounts at post offices. Those ideas, she can get those back into the spotlight on the Democratic agenda, where you'll see presidential candidates talking about them and maybe trying to institute them if they win the presidency. And more in the near term, I'm sure the student loan issue. If you're going to create a bill to start bailing out student loans, that's where it would start, and she may be the kind of person that would try to put that into play.
Mike, when we think about the actual share prices for banks and the factors that affects that, both houses of Congress switching to the Democrats would be much more of a worry than just one. We're not likely to see waves of legislation that really changes the course.
Yeah, unlikely. I mean, I do think, though, it does reflect the thrust of the Democratic Party as it is right now. So therefore, maybe these will be issues that are more surfaced in 2020. But those share prices that you refer to, they're not really embedding some great deregulated future that people are banking on. I mean, they really are cheap. If people really thought that there was going to be, freewheeling higher returns to come, even though we have the Consumer Financial Protection Board basically sidelined at this point, I don't really see that as a risk, mostly because the stocks don't embed any of those expectations.
I mean, Bill, remember when President Trump came into office pushing deregulation? He basically used banks as his main
personnel
example.
Office.
Right. He was saying that too, but also that Dodd-Frank has been too strict. We're going to look at ways to roll it back. They need to lend more. I mean, that was supposed to be very helpful to the banks.
Well, he
did
did
that
roll
actually
back.
happen?
I think that a lot of that has happened. As I said, most of that has happened for banks smaller than those with $50 billion in assets. So, most of what we think of as Wall Street that we're surrounded by here, it didn't really affect them. But I think the tenor in Washington was much better in the last few years and better for banks. And that may be changing, but not in a material way. It's hard to imagine the big banks actually being more regulated than they kind of are now. I mean, there are real curbs on their liquidity, on their leverage. They have to have a lot of capital. There's restrictions on what they can really do. I mean, Maxine Waters can talk a lot about what she might change, but I'm not really sure what she would do that could pass both houses of Congress and get the president's signature that would result in more regulation for big banks.
Jimmy, this president probably no. But listen, I think you underestimate how imaginative politicians can be on some of these issues. Listen, if Democrats decided they wanted to, raise capital levels further, you would find some Republicans who thought that would be a good idea. There is this sort of anti-bigness, anti-monopoly stuff going on in both parties right now, and it's not hard to imagine, maybe not under this president, a future president, where those two sides come together, whether it's banks or big tech.
Jimmy, does bashing banks still score a lot of points for politicians?
Listen, I think there are sectors in both parties where that works. I think there's certainly you've had this progressive kickback on the left where they felt that the Obama administration went way too easy on the bank, that it should have been nationalized. You should have seen more CEOs go to jail. He listened too much to Tim Geithner, who they viewed as, I think unfairly as a creature of Wall Street. There is definitely a blowback against that. I think you're seeing that now with a lot of progressive politicians who think, wait a minute, we miss an opportunity to do something about inequality and concentrated corporate power, and maybe we should do something about that now since we didn't do it back under President Obama.